Now I'm making a third video about slaughter on the Crozat Canal. The part 1 and part 2 that I each already made were an hour and 50 minutes long each, rather long. A friend suggested to me that some people would like my digressions about all the individuals and who they were and what they did after the war and so on. Others might just want the straight battle narrative, so I went through and cut out all the digressions, and this is what I'm recording. Hopefully I can get through this one in a single episode. So I've called it Slaughter on the Crozat Canal, no digressions, just the battle. Now here is an overview from the war diary of the 7th Somerset Light Infantry. Enemy crossed the canal below our right flank, capturing Jussy and Flavy. There's Jussy there, which forced us to retire to Lt.Col. Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel Troit Bullock DSO was severely wounded, the acting adjutant Barry killed, and a lot of the others killed or wounded or captured. That's the overall summary of what was going to happen. So they had been well off the front line. You can see where the front line is here, where the Germans got their breakthrough. By the third day, the Germans were reaching the Crozat Canal, and the Somersets were brought up to defend this section. You can see Jussy on the bottom right of that box, and I've placed a rectangle in red there where the 7th Somersets were told to defend the line. Now this account comes from Captain Foley, who was with the battalion. He wrote 2 accounts of this battle, one in a privately published book in 1920, just after he got back from his prisoner of war camp in Germany, and the other in the 1930s, which was a collection of pieces written by different men who had been in the 7th Somersets, and he was given the job of writing the chapter about this battle, and I borrow from both his accounts. And here's what he had to say. My memories of that tragic month are now 14 years old, yet they remain as clear and vivid as ever. They pivot naturally around the 21st of the month, the day in which the German attack in front of St. Quentin was launched, and I find that in my own case, and such memories as these must perforce be somewhat personal, they fall into 3 periods. There were the weeks that led up to the 21st, a time which but for one thing would have been the happiest the battalion spent in all its service in France. Then came the deluge, when we soon found ourselves, to our surprise, and I think to some extent to our pleasure, certainly to our vast excitement, engaged in open warfare. The nearest we had got to this in the past was the Somme, or Third Ypres, or Cambrai. But except for Cambrai, that warfare was an oyster compared with what now befell us. We were not slow to feel the thrill of it. In a sense, one might describe it as Salisbury Plain with the gloves off. Salisbury Plain was where they did military manoeuvres in England. And though it was soon to become so exceedingly open that there was a grave danger of it never closing up again, it was an experience like none other in the war since the very early days in 1914, and as such it merits some attempt by those involved in it to record their impressions. Finally, as far as I was concerned, came the horror of that last Sunday, a hot sunny day, the 24th of March, when I and the only 2 men left alive in our trench were surrounded by the enemy and fell into their hands. When I was awakened in the early hours of the 21st of March by a sustained thunderous drumming away to the east, I knew that a bombardment of exceptional intensity was in progress, and that the German attack must have started, as in fact it had, and up to this point in human history there had never been an artillery barrage of this scale. Picture us then, on the morning of March 22nd, holding the line of the Crozat Canal opposite St. Simon. My D Company, about 120 strong, holding a mile on the left. C Company under Whitworth, holding another mile away towards Jussy on the right. The other 2 companies were in reserve, with Battalion HQ and the railway cutting at Hain. Thick mist enveloped everything, and one could barely see across the canal, which along our front was broad and deep. It was spanned in several places by bridges of various size, the principal crossing being the great iron road bridge leading straight into St. Simon. We regarded these bridges with a good deal of interest, for it was apparent, even to my somewhat unmilitary mind, that when the Boche developed his attack, it would have to be by way of these artificial crossings, the canal constituting too severe an obstacle at this point to be tackled in any other way. Well, he was wrong, and so were so many other British. The Germans knew the terrain they were going to be attacking over and came prepared. The pioneers were bringing up pontoon rafts and so on, and then, in fact, the place where the Germans would cross was a place where they created their own crossing point, a critical mistake on the part of the British. Now, there is no single trench map, so I've used 4 from the National Library of Scotland and patched them together to let you see the general area of the battle. Here is St. Simon on the left, There is Jussy down on the bottom right, and this is the section of the canal where this assault is going to land. Now, roughly speaking, this is where they were holding. D Company on the left, C Company on the right, B Company in reserve, Battalion HQ back at Anhui, and A Company somewhere vaguely in that general area. Now, the different battalions who were told to hold the section of the canal give varying descriptions of how much they were told to hold. So Foley says D Company had a mile and C Company had a mile. But each one of these boxes here is only 1,000 yards. So if they were holding a mile, 2 miles between them, that was more than the distance between St. Simon and Jussy. So that's clearly an exaggeration. The 7th Rifles, who are just off to their right, they claimed they were holding 2,700 yards, and that would be the entire distance between Jussy and St. Simon. So I think all of these guys are rather exaggerating how much ground they were supposed to hold. Oh yes, and the whole reason I initially got interested in this whole battlefield, and particularly this engagement, the third day of the German offensive, was that my grandmother's brother was with the 11th Royal Fusiliers, and there was a German breakthrough where they were. He was killed and his body was never found. And so my initial focus of my research was just to the right of the village of Jussy, but then I got interested to see were there any other breakthroughs to the left or the right. And I ended up heavily researching 4 different breakthroughs, and this is the leftmost, or the westernmost, of the German breakthroughs. I will in due course make episodes about the other breakthroughs as well. And yes, that's where the Germans were coming from. Now, they'd already smashed the British first and second lines of defences. This canal was a desperate and not properly prepared third line of defences. And there was, in fact, one German division consisting of 3 regiments for every single British battalion that was trying to hold the canal. Roughly speaking, it was somewhere between a 10 to 11 to 1 numeric advantage to the Germans. So they could afford to attack everywhere and anywhere and soak up the losses and just overwhelm the British defences. And yes, it was rather shocking for the British officers. Here is a photo on the left of the road bridge as it looks today from the British side of the canal across to St. Simon, and there's an old postcard showing you what St. Simon looked like roughly about this time period. Thus the problem of where to dispose my scanty forces really solved itself. They were put to dig in where best they could command with their fire the approaches to each bridge. All bridges had demolition charges laid under them, connected by wire to the Royal Engineer officers' dugout on the St. Simon Road just west of the Iron Bridge. Of the 4 platoons in my company, only 3 were commanded by officers, but Sergeant Wood, who was in charge of the 4th, was an excellent NCO. Of my officers, Squibb was small but sturdy, with a cheerful outlook on things and a practical turn that had often been of great help to me. On reaching the west bank of the canal, I halted the company a little way down the main road, and then took Squibb and Mitchell in turn, and decided with them where we should place the different sentry posts. Mitchell was an older Scotsman in his 40s who had been a policeman in Dundee. This was not altogether easy, as it was pretty dark, the ground was new to us, and above all, there was absolutely no time to lose. We had, I should think, some 800 or 900 yards of the canal to hold, not a mile, as he said earlier, and this comprised 2 road bridges, 2 wooden pontoons, and half a dozen small footbridges. Squibb's platoon I had on the left, Sergeant Wood in the centre, Mitchell on the right, and Hayward some 600 yards back in reserve. He described Hayward as barely more than a boy. Hayward would not survive this battle. The men started straight away getting their trenches dug. There was practically no interruption, although the enemy kept up a pretty continuous fire on the main road just west of the bridge. By dawn, the very small garrisons were down under cover. As was usually the case at that time, in the early morning of the 22nd there was a thick mist, and it was very cold, but we managed to get some hot tea and bacon going, and at last I was able to have an hour or two's rest. Everything in front seemed quiet, and I certainly did not expect to be engaged with the enemy that day. However, if he came, we were ready for him. My men posted at all the bridges, and the Royal Engineers officer sitting in a dugout ready to press a button and blow the bridges sky high as soon as it became apparent that our resistance east of the canal had broken down. Exactly what the situation was in front we could not at that time ascertain, and among the first thing I had to do on that Friday morning was to send forward small patrols to try to get in touch with some of our troops in front. This they failed to do in the time allotted. It was fairly obvious, however, that things were not going altogether well with us. Every now and then we could hear bursts of rifle fire, and the bursts always seemed to be drawing nearer. By 10 o'clock, the mist had cleared. Our strength on the canal bank, moreover, would not have allowed of any serious opposition to a strong enemy attack, for as we have seen, the posts were only roughly sighted, were separated widely from one another, and hastily dug. However, the men were told as usual that their posts were to be held at all costs. St Simon itself is on a small knoll, so that it entirely overlooked our positions along the canal bank. The canal all along our front was broad and deep, impassable except by the bridges. The ground behind us was marshy and wooded, so that practically our only means of retreat were by the main road and by a small by-road branching off from it. And I used a different setting on Google Maps to give you a sense of just how swampy and wet it was south of the canal, although the German accounts describing knee-deep water north of the canal make me think it was considerably more soggy up there as well back in 1918. I suppose it was nearly 11 when we were returning up the small by-road towards the canal bank. The rifle fire in front had been going on intermittently all morning, but now suddenly it burst out with great violence immediately in front of us, and obviously very close. The next thing we knew was that machine gun bullets were sweeping up and down the road and whistling all around us. This was a more startling development than I had expected, and although this is a shot from the movie 1917, I suspect their reaction looked something quite like that. We hurried on as fast as we could up the road, meeting on the way Jones, the Brigade intelligence officer, who shouted to us that the Germans had reached the canal bank, thereby thoroughly living up to his title, various excited Royal Engineers personnel making good their escape, and a runaway mess cart. And yes, that was very dry, sarcastic English humour, much in the lines of this Blackadder photo where you can see Blackadder looking at the other officer and thinking, "What an idiot!" I found the men lining the bank and firing rather wildly, as is their wont at these moments of crisis, but as a careful survey of the opposite bank disclosed no sign of the enemy, I stopped them firing, and we lay low to await developments. The machine gun fire continued, and we could also hear away to our right the explosions of a trench mortar. I was naturally anxious to find out if the destruction of the bridges had been successful. While we were running towards the canal when the firing started, I had noticed several heavy explosions and had concluded that all was well, but it was now time to make certain that the Royal Engineers had done their work thoroughly, and that no passage had been left for the enemy to cross the canal. And this photo is a photo of the Crozat Canal. I'm not able to tell exactly which section of the canal, but possibly even somewhere in the vicinity of where Foley was. I left my HQ, therefore, and started along the canal towards the main road. To my disgust, I found that while the main road bridge, a heavy iron structure, was broken in half, with two ends forming a sort of V in the water, a temporary wooden erection of the Royal Engineers, fit for heavy traffic, was still perfectly intact. There were still some bullets flying about, and the main road was getting an occasional shell, so I hurried on with all speed to the Royal Engineer dugout to beard the wizard in his den and point out his deficiencies. But here I had a further surprise. The officer and all his myrmidons had gone. The dugout was empty. At this point Mitchell joined me. He saw the gravity of the situation and instantly presented an example of the power which training and discipline can exercise on the human mind. Among a large quantity of explosive substances in the Royal Engineers' dugout, we found a box of Mills bombs. We would call those grenades today. Mitchell immediately conceived the idea of destroying the footbridge by throwing bombs at it, and this he proceeded to do, not in the way I should have chosen, by lying protected behind the bank and thence hurling his missiles, but by standing on the bank in full view of the other side, and carrying out what can only be described as a dignified form of bombing practice. I wouldn't swear to it, but I'm almost certain I heard him counting 3 after drawing the pin. No hostile shot rang out. If any enemy were watching, they were too much impressed by this exhibition of how to throw a Mills bomb to fire. But it was apparent at once that Mills bombs as bridge destructors were a complete failure. Luckily for them, they had a corporal who actually seemed to know something about how to work with high explosives, and Corporal Peppard stepped forward. With Peppard's help, we fixed up a length of time fuse and a detonator. Corporal Peppard then lit the fuse, which I devoutly prayed was not instantaneous. Providentially it was not, and we were able to retire behind the canal bank to await developments. The fuse was a slow one, and while it was gradually smouldering down, the commanding officer, Troit Bullock, who in his indefatigable way had been up and around our position since the early morning, was just in time for the explosion, which was a great success, blowing out the whole centre of the bridge and causing no small delight among the troops. Having thus broken the ice, we were able to finish the other bridges during the course of the day. Corporal Peppard worked like a blank and seemed to revel in his job. And yes, you can read for yourself the word that Foley used in his account. I'm not going to pronounce it myself, but I don't believe in censoring out language that people used at the time. And this is a mix of the two accounts. By 1 o'clock, March 23rd, our position to the right of the main road were becoming untenable, owing to the constant fire kept up on them. Then I got a message from Whitworth, commanding C Company on my right, saying that he was withdrawing under orders from the commanding officer to the railway cutting at Anois, in other words, to Battalion HQ. Now then, Foley decides to bring his company in retreat. We reach the railway at a level crossing without difficulty, and turn to the left on the far side of it, filing along under cover of the bank and hedge. Anois being some way further up the line, I left Hayward with the 2 platoons in a little wood, and went on myself with an orderly to report to Battalion HQ. Now you can see that the wood is still very similar to it, so based on what he says, hitting the railway line and then turning left, I think this must be roughly where they were. Mitchell and Squibb went off independently by other routes, and that was the last I saw of them until eventually we met in a prison camp in Germany. We had not gone many yards up the line when straight ahead of us we saw some men crossing it in single file. I immediately took it that they marked the spot where Battalion HQ were established, and was hurrying on when my orderly, whose sight was considerably better than mine, suddenly stopped short. He took a good look at the figures ahead of us, and then announced in no uncertain terms that they were Germans. He was a bit of a booby, this man, and at first I thought he was mad, but only a few steps were enough to convince me that what he said was perfectly true. And I got a photo from one of these German regimental histories that shows what the visibility conditions were like even after the mist lifted. You can see why you'd have to get a reasonably close to be able to tell if they were British or German. This discovery came as rather a shock. At the worst, I'd imagined that the enemy might have forced a crossing of the canal and established himself on our side of it. But to find the position which only a few hours before had been wired me as Battalion HQ actually occupied by the enemy was utterly staggering and completely altered my whole outlook on the situation. And I borrowed this photo from the New Zealand National Army Museum for the expression on his face, because I imagine Foley must have said something along the lines of, "Well, bleep." Next we turn to get the German side of it. The spearhead of the assault on this point of the canal was led by Grenadier Regiment Graf Kleist von Nollendorf, the 1st West Prussians, No. 6. And on the right, that is the battle flag of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadiers. This is a map from their regimental history. Schlacht in Frankreich, just the attack in France, March of 1918. They were part of the 10th Division, and this was the line of the attack that is described in this quote. At 4 o'clock in the morning, it was not yet dawn, as the Grenadier Regiment headed for Castres, which is about where that B is on the map, 5 kilometres south of Esseny, and just under 3 kilometres from the canal and Camas Farm. Here's Camas Farm. The division was tasked with throwing the enemy across the canal, forcing a passage behind them, and advancing to Flavey-le-Martel's train station, which is just here at this crossroads. The advance of the 1st Battalion under Captain Puttkamer on the right wing led into a wooded area of the Camas Farm, some 100 metres from the canal. This grove was flooded and the adjacent meadows were swampy, so that the Grenadiers had to repeatedly wade through knee-deep water. The battalion receives heavy enemy machine gun fire, and the order, machine guns forward. The brave gunners march through the exposed water. They are admirable. After several drops, they arrive at the edge of the wood, drenched to the skin. I have to comment, this is all my own translation. My German is not perfect. Any mistakes are, of course, my own. Now, here we have, there's Castres, which is just mentioned. That's Camas Wood in the box, and on the bottom right, there's Camas Farm. And down here, here's Flavey-le-Martel, and the train station is round about here somewhere. And this is again just shows how incredibly similar the geography still is today. Camas Farm, well, there's still farm buildings in that exact location. You can see this clearing on the south bank of the canal is there on the 1918 trench maps and on a modern Google satellite map. Even this wine glass shape wood here is still got exactly the same shape, and this is the direction they had to head. And there's a bit more of a close-up. You can see here that these are the buildings of Camas Farm around this little odd piece of road here, and this is a large pond. There's lots of water in here, there's water all over here. It's still very, very similar to what it was back then. And there it is again. Now, they give these contradictory accounts of how much ground they were supposed to be holding. So the 7th Somersets was supposed to be holding 2,000 yards, if you believe Foley's account. The 8th Rifle said they were holding 2,700 yards. Well, 2,700 yards is the entire distance from Jussy all the way to St. Simon, so they can't all be right. I think they're all just exaggerating a little bit how much they were trying to hold. Lieutenant Carres, leader of the 1st Machine Gun Company, is given the task to cover the crossing over the canal with his fire and at the same time to explore to find a suitable place. The terrain rose slightly to the canal. The opposite side, interspersed with trees and shrubs, was occupied with machine guns and snipers and was not visible in the fog. The enemy opened fire with well-aimed shots at even the slightest movement. Nevertheless, Lieutenant Carres managed to bring his machine guns into position, but with considerable losses. Lieutenant Pomorski's killed, 2nd Lieutenant Ramirez badly wounded. When comrades reach him, he gets shot again. Numerous grenadiers are taken out by English bullets, for example the gunners Berner and Gorney. Lieutenant Carres had a bullet go through his map that was spread out in front of him. Another punched directly into the machine gun, a Weissfeldwebel Zeilmeier. Now these are actually quite interesting names. Carres, I believe, is a Lithuanian name because this regiment was recruited in what is today northeast Poland, quite close, well, back then it was called Prussia, and it's also quite close to Lithuania. So one of their officers had a Lithuanian name, and you can also see there's a very distinctly ethnically Polish name here amongst the casualties, Lieutenant Pomorski. Zeilmeier, I can't help wondering if he was Jewish. But our side was firing too, and after crossing over the canal, many dead shooters were found, 4 on one machine gun alone. Also, the Fusilier Battalion, headed by the 9th Company, Lieutenant Kraft, suddenly received fire from diagonally to the right. Immediately, the 9th Company independently deployed. I suspect, based on what I know about the British deployments, that would have been C Company of the 7th Somerset Light Infantry that was shooting at the Fusilier Battalion. For the other companies, Major Gustav, calm and cold-blooded as always, had rapid advance blown on a bugle, and the battalion, although not without losses, dispersed in full order. The defence fire from the invisible enemy, hidden by the fog, becomes stronger and stronger. Our companies laboriously work their way through bushes and ditches. Finally it clears up a bit, and they manage to get themselves somewhat oriented. But if they show themselves even a little bit, it means almost certain death. The English shoot very well. Weissfeldwebel Fruhauf of the 9th Company, who, as it turns out later, was promoted to become an officer on March 22nd, was badly wounded right at the beginning. Lieutenant Buchner Wolfram and Lieutenant Kasperite Alfred of the 10th Company fall. Lieutenant Latterman suffers a serious head wound. This is Lieutenant Buchner on the bottom right. From just the 9th Company alone, 17 men are put out of action here on the canal. I lied down for a long time, writes the leader of this company, Lieutenant Kraft, next to Lieutenant Latterman in a small depression behind a barn, which is a special target for the enemy machine guns. After crawling around for hours, I managed to find out about the situation in my company. Fortunately, I found them in a ditch 15 metres ahead, which offered them some protection and the possibility of forming a skirmish line. Then, as the English heavy artillery fire sets in, I crawled to the battalion staff behind the stone wall of a paddock. So the Fusilier Battalion waited out the night. Then the order came that the battalion should move to the right, near the 1st. With the utmost caution, the Fusiliers got to the canal and sought protection on its embankment. The 2nd Battalion, on the left of the Fusilier Battalion, had also received fire from out of the mist near the Crozat Canal. At its head was the 5th Company under Lieutenant Blumel. In front of the canal, writes Corporal Dunker, of this company I performed a patrol with my group, 1 MM and Sergeant Teschka. Now, for the life of me, I haven't been able to work out what MM stands for. One of my theories is it's a medium Minenwerfer, a medium mortar. My other theory is that it was a typo and it's supposed to say 1 MG, so he had 1 machine gun with him. The German abbreviation for machine gun, by the way, is the same. It's MG. When we got to the edge of the wood at 150 metres, we received fire. We first returned fires, and the company went ahead with jump, up, march, march. They came upon a bridge that had just been blown up by the English and burned. Lieutenant Blumel, as good as ever, tried to cross it before it was completely destroyed, but was badly wounded. His notes say, "We're on the canal. Over there is machine gun fire. On the left, a half-ruined bridge. From the right, a shout, 'See what's going on with the bridge!' In small leaps I run with 2 people. Then, a strong blow to my formerly broken ankle. A machine gun bullet has shattered it. Koppelman takes over the company. Kalka and Fischer pull me back slowly. Officer Cadet Dalevsky of the 5th Company was seriously wounded when he tried to get back in the midst of the heavy machine gun fire. Now, the 2nd Battalion was the same as the others, in front of the canal." Back to the 1st Battalion. As on the previous day, the sun had parted the fog here in the late morning. Gorgeous sunshine lay over the landscape. The battalion had explored a crossing point about 300 metres southwest of Camas, which seemed to be favourable because the opposite bank was a little too high and so steep that the crossing point probably had to be in a blind spot in places. And by the way, this actually is the crossing point of these Grenadiers. The photo was taken after they had pushed the British back, but this is the point where they were crossing. This photo comes from their regimental history. And I was also, thanks to the beauty of the trench maps and Google Street View, to positively ID this as Camas Farm. So this is precisely the point where the Grenadiers were told to head to. And then when I turned to the left using Google Street View to look in the direction of the canal, this is the direction where the Germans were advancing. The canal is just behind those closer trees and just in front of the trees that are a little bit further away. The troops also succeed in some places to get to the canal, and the company of the 5th Pioneers assigned to the regiment immediately proceeded with great determination to cross on rafts and individual planks. But all attempts failed. The enemy dominated the canal area only too well with his excellently placed machine guns. So it was said, for better or worse, that the 1st Battalion would wait for the protective darkness of the night. So we turn now to the war diary of the 8th Rifles. I called them 7th for some reason a little bit earlier. The 8th Rifles, who were supposed to be holding this section of the canal. March 22nd. Battalion in position north of Jussy on Canal Bank. Disposed as follows on front of about 2,700 yards. I've already commented that was garbage. They absolutely were not holding that much ground. Anyway, A Company on right, C Company centre, D Company left. B Company in reserve at Flavy-le-Martel. I've underlined D Company because I actually have an eyewitness report from the officer who was in command of D Company, but we'll get to that later. In touch on left with 20th Division, the 7th Somerset Light Infantry, and on right with 5th Lancers and 43rd Infantry Brigade. Enemy appear about 7 a.m. 2 platoons of B, Reserve Company, brought into front line between C and D companies. Another 2 platoons take up position along Chateau Road. At 9 a.m, enemy patrol attempted to cross canal, but driven off. One of the problems we have here is to the left of the 8th Rifles is where their brigade sector ends, and in fact where their division sector ends. So the 7th Somersets were in a completely different division from the 8th Rifles. This is why I think that they had very poor coverage in the ground between them. It was one of those weak points in the line. Enemy put down heavy machine gun barrage all day, especially down Chateau Road. The chateau is, by the way, down here, Chateau de Savriennois. So it's just down there on the bottom left of this map. And especially down the Chateau Road and enfilading Canal Bank. During afternoon, enemy artillery shells, area between Canal Bank and Flavy. Heavy casualties to battalion. At dusk, enemy attempted to cross canal in force, but driven off by D Company with Lewis guns. Enemy sustained heavy casualties. About midnight, enemy patrol crossed canal. 3 of their patrol captured, remainder killed. So far, the accounts from the British and the Germans seem to pretty closely correspond with each other. But then the war diary just says for March 23rd, Germans cross canal. This is rather convenient the way they leave it out. So the 22nd is all about how they stop them crossing. And then March 23rd, they're suddenly across, and there's no account of how they got across, why the 8th Rifles failed to stop them crossing. There's no explanation in the war diary. Oh, just they're across now. By 5 p.m. on March 22nd, the artillery had approached and had begun to fire on the enemy machine gun nests, so that they could be suppressed to some extent. Major Christoph therefore ordered that the pioneers bring material together from the nearby partially burning houses to prepare for the crossing. Despite fierce artillery fire, they carried out this order brave and undaunted. In the course of the day, the mortars had come up to the area of Clastres with much difficulty. As soon as it is light, the task carries on. The horses give their last. Everyone pulls or pushes. There is more need of the harnesses, and we have to expect that you will need us in the front. Lieutenant Glom goes out with the patrol to requisition harnesses and horses, and we finally find what we need in a small homestead. Horses, mules, and impeccable harnesses. And he hurries back with the bare essentials, and retensioning goes fast, and we march further on. And this is another photo from this exact attack. The Germans had mastered by now combined arms operation, and they knew they had to have the mortars, the machine guns, and the artillery right up there at the front with the advancing infantry. They had aerial cover from the planes and all of the rest as well. And but it was not easy terrain. They had to get through no man's land, which you can imagine was a sticky, shell-filled bog, and this whole area had been fought over before. So it was not easy at all, and they really went through some rather difficult terrain to get the guns up. We pass 2 English 15-centimetre long-barrelled guns. The crews are dead next to them. We see the terrible effect of the gas. As soon as the fog gives way, aircraft activity starts again, and once more dogfights develop. The flak bursts in between them, and some aircraft crash, burning. We come to Clastres. We stay in a dugout overnight. We do not suffer, and even the food is abundant. But night is bitterly cold, and this was the account of Vice Sgt Hoffman, Vice Feldwebel. And then we have the account of the crossing over the Crozat Canal on the night of the 22nd to the 23rd of March. And this one is rather over-dramatic, but don't blame me. I told you my German's not perfect, but it's not this bad. They really did have this completely over-the-top tone. I usually think of Germans as being very disciplined and, not very humorous, but I think this completely changed my picture of German character, at least when it comes to describing battles. Okay, let's get to it. It's getting dark. Everyone eagerly listens out in the darkness and anxiously asks each other whether the enemy will notice our intentions too soon and whether our plans be successful. A comrade-in-arms describes this bold nighttime enterprise in a vivid and lively way. He writes, "Dull moonshine covers the landscape. There are enemy planes high above the regiment, and we wait for their bombs. Everything is silent as we listen to the airy hum of their engines. Nope. The English do not see the Grenadiers. The haze on the canal is a good ally. They thought the troops were even further from the canal and dropped their heavy bombs on the village we passed through, probably Clastres. In the sparse dim light, you see individual figures flitting back and forth. Here, one jumps up and disappears into bushes. Orderlies bring orders. Pioneers haul beams and rafts up and make the last technical arrangements for crossing. Silently, the Grenadiers lie behind the high embankment. There is nothing to be heard except now and then an enemy machine gun fires, with which the enemy pounds the embankment, and the fire of both sides' artillery, which keeps the approaches to the destroyed bridges under harassing fire. No, old Tommy, Prussian Grenadiers are not that stupid. They will not come there. You'll be surprised. There, a soft splashing. What's this? The first beam raft just pushes away from the shore side. Almost noiselessly, the leader lifts the raft pole out of the water to push the first raft over again with another powerful thrust. Meanwhile, at the edge of the bush, the rest of the 3rd Company, it's them who are crossing first, are at their guns, peering at the shore on the other side. All machine guns are ready to fire into the bushes. Now we're ready. Woe to any of the enemy. If he were to show himself on the other shore, he would be covered with a hail of bullets. Everyone knows that it is a question of life and death for the first few men who are crossing. Are they over there? Then the crossing goes faster. 2 figures, Englishmen, run along the other side of the canal bank. They flit like ghosts and disappear. Did they recognize something in the thick fog? Will enemy artillery fire soon fall on the crossing point? This thought flashes through everyone's minds. Thank God, no. The English artillery fortunately continues to shoot at the wrong spot. "Ah, there's still plenty of room," a blasé grenadier was heard to say when a big shell comes in, and everyone who hears it is pleased with the humour. The photo on the bottom right is actually a German pontoon bridge. It was actually captured by New Zealand forces on the Suez Canal when the Turks attempted to use it to attack the canal in 1915, but it is a German-designed pontoon boat. Already, some groups are crossing the canal, with heavy machine guns ready to support them. The hardest job already seems to have been finished. But no, 2 rafts are to do the work, and the whole regiment should cross on them if possible, and each can only hold 4 men. Meanwhile, the pioneers have already started a bridge. If they do not hurry, it'll be day before the work is completed. The pioneers tirelessly bring up their rafting equipment. The pioneers tirelessly lug their pontoons, their beams and poles. Iron will inspires them. And luckily I was able to also find the history of the specific regiment of pioneers who were told to assist with this assault. Now, it's a very brief account because the 5th Lower Silesian pioneers were actually dispersed between quite a number of different regiments, so necessarily their accounts of what any one company was doing are brief, but this is what they had to say about what was going on this section of the Crozat Canal. The second day of combat took the company to the Crozat Canal, where, after searching for bridging points, a crossing was provided for the 6 grenadiers to get across the canal. A catwalk was pushed across the canal, but when the men who were crossing became unsettled and a man fell into the water, the crossing faltered and the bridge had to be divided into rafts, by which the 2nd Battalion took the other bank. Later, pontoons approached, which were initially used for crossing. The next morning the pontoon bridge was hit, and a gangway was built next to it. There were significant difficulties in bringing forward the pontoons, as the horses faltered and the marshy ground was unstable. Only 1 platoon of the pioneers was used, while the other platoons participated in the rapidly advancing attack. The following day brought the order for the company to build a heavy column bridge, in which the 2nd and the Pioneer Company No. 304 were also involved. Back to the Grenadiers' own account. After about 1.5 hours, the neither company has crossed. I think that just means the rear guard, the final company. Everyone was glad when the short but scary ride was over. The opposite shore was quickly occupied, and under this protection further crossings and bridge building are progressing rapidly, although the enemy scatters the canal and eastern bank in constant bursts of fire. In the midst of the work, advance posts come back, and, out of breath, they call, "The English are coming!" Right, there's a crack in the bushes, and then there is a raging machine gun and rifle fire from our positions. Only with difficulty could we stop this fire. Some rifles had to be torn from men's shoulders. Thanks to the energy of Sergeant Hagedorn, it was possible to bring the firing to a stop. What had it been? An enemy patrol had come across the German sentries at the canal, and then, most surprised to find Germans there, had hurriedly retreated. 1 company after another joins the 3rd company. Immediately they form a bridgehead in front of the crossing point. With hand grenades, Lieutenant Knobloch of the 1st Company attacks an English nest that is 2 heavy and 2 light machine guns. It was only a few metres away from the canal embankment. He is severely wounded, and Corporal Walzarski is killed. Sergeant Burgau was the leader of a light machine gun squad who had first reached the other bank of the canal and whose gun inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. During the crossing, Lieutenant Glom also brought his mortars into operation for the first time. The closer we got to the canal, the livelier the machine gun fire became, and calls for our own machine guns and mortars also got louder. Lieutenant Glom went and explored, and we stalked as close as possible to the canal embankment and got the launchers ready. Soon we launched strike after strike on the enemy positions. After a bombardment of barely half an hour, the English machine guns were suppressed. The account of Weisfeldwebel Hoffman. Now we turn to the account of the history of the Rifle Brigade, and it quotes a letter written by Lieutenant Gould. As the morning drew on, the enemy, under cover of very heavy machine gun fire, threw a 1-man footbridge across the canal on our left flank. Fire was immediately brought to bear on the ends of this bridge by Vickers and Lewis guns, and a company of the enemy, massed on the far side of the bridge ready to cross, had heavy casualties. 2nd Lieutenant Grant made the necessary arrangements for defending this bridge with great courage and judgment. At this juncture, 3 of the enemy, who had apparently waded across the canal, were captured, trying to gain a footing on our side. These were sent down to HQ with Rifleman Bennett. I suspect they were the ones who ran across first before the bridge fell apart. It was obvious shortly afterwards that the enemy had succeeded in effecting a lodgment on the south side of the canal, as my position was enfiladed by machine guns from the marsh to the right. At about 11:30 a.m. I had word from my right platoon that the enemy was overrunning the bank, and I therefore ordered my company to fall back onto the left, with the possibility of forming a defensive flank. On attempting to carry out this manoeuvre, however, I found that a lodgment had been effected by the enemy well to the left. Also, my company was being subjected to scissors machine gun fire. This is when you've got machine guns in two different positions, 90 degrees apart from each other, so their bullets are effectively crossing each other at 90 degrees. Particularly deadly if you're being subjected to that. The only course open was a retirement through the marsh, and this was commenced. No sign of the enemy or our own troops was seen until clear of the marsh, and we were then fired on by our own troops, one man being hit in the army line, some friendly fire. By crawling about 500 yards, cavalry could be seen in action east of Jussy. That makes no sense to me. Given where they were, they couldn't see anything east of Jussy. I wonder if they meant south of Jussy? The remainder of my company eventually managed to get in touch with some of the Somersets from the 20th Division Right Battalion. That's my 7th Somersets. And Gould himself was wounded shortly thereafter. Back to the Prussians. Meanwhile, under the energetic personal direction of the commander of the pioneers, Major Stobber, the pontoon bridge was completed, on which further crossings take place. The Grenadier Regiment deserves the fame of being the first regiment to have forced a crossing of the canal in the area of Assault Group C. They had paid for it with bloody sacrifices, of course. Lieutenants Buchner, Kasperite, Alfred, Pomorski, 38 NCOs and men had fallen, and 11 were missing. Lieutenants Blumel, Roma, Gutknecht, Reimann, Erich, Fruhauf and Latterman, Noblak were wounded, along with Officer Deputy Delevsky and 96 men. Now I turn to 3 different circumstances leading to capture. These are accounts by British officers who were captured that day, and when they were repatriated to England were required to fill out these forms about exactly how they came to surrender to the Germans. So in this case we have John Fife Smith, a proud Scotsman who had wanted to serve with any Scottish regiment, and he was therefore sent to serve with Englishmen in the Rifle Brigade. And this is how he described the situation. At 2:30 a.m. on the 22nd of March, I was in command of No. 13 Platoon D Company, which company was left on bank of Jussy Canal to hold on to position with a view to delaying enemy and giving other troops time to form and consolidate a line farther back. At dawn the same morning, the enemy appeared on the opposite bank, and about 3 a.m. the following morning was discovered in part of wood in my right by patrol. For the remainder of night and up to 1:30 p.m. the following day, we fought him in the wood. On the aforementioned hour, I received a gunshot wound across the left thigh. The scar still remained, being about 3 inches by 2 inches, which made it impossible for me to get about except by crawling. About a minute afterwards, my sergeant was instantaneously killed, shot through the head, and then he's got a note at the bottom of the page that says, "Sentence submitted. At this time I had 7 men left whom I ordered to join the platoon on my left." The Germans came up to me while endeavouring to stop the bleeding of my wound and bandaged it for me. They left no guard in charge, and when night came I succeeded in getting back as far as Flavy, which he spells wrong, which I found to be occupied by the enemy. There I discovered myself still kilometres from my own line, and after remaining under cover until about 10 a.m. was found by a Red Cross party of the enemy who had me taken to temporary hospital at Flavy. And this is pretty typical. The German Red Cross or troops find wounded British, they bandage them up and then just leave them behind and carry on with the assault. A second eyewitness account, this time by Edward Percy Blundell. He came from Cheshire, very close to Liverpool. On March 22nd, 1918, at 2 a.m, I was in charge of 2 posts on the canal bank between Clastres and Jussy. Second Lieutenant Sproston, acting officer commanding C Company, being in command of the company at Company HQ. Entrenchments were dug and preparations made to resist the enemy advance. The line on my left was under the command of Lieutenant Gould D Company, 8th Rifle Brigade, and on my right was under 2nd Lieutenant Dixon. The enemy attacked between 8 and 9 a.m, eventually getting entrenched on the opposite bank of the canal. 4 runners were sent to company headquarters for supplies of bombs and ammunition, but only one managed to get through the line again with 50 rounds of small arms ammunition. Touch at this time was lost with the left company, owing to enemy machine gun fire sweeping the ground between the posts. Enemy attempts to cross the canal were beaten off. 2 men were killed and some wounded. During the afternoon, touch was again established with the left company by runner. After 7 p.m, enemy activity again increased, and heavy machine gun fire swept our positions. Eventually, enemy patrols succeeded in crossing the canal on the left flank. Heavy patrol fighting took place, during which his patrols were driven back again. At 11 p.m, the officer commanding company informed me that a relief was taking place from the left. I don't know what he's talking about there. There was no relief coming. At the same hour, Mr. Dixon was killed. After Mr. Dixon's death, I kept the left post of his company under supervision. The relief did not come through, and I decided to hold on till the last. At 1:30 a.m. on March 23rd, the enemy threw over a number of bombs, wounding 4 men and myself. At 2:15 a.m, He became very active and the machine gun fire very heavy. He threw a number of bombs over, 4 of which came into the post, injured the men in charge of the Lewis gun. I took charge of the gun and the onrush was beaten off. Whilst firing the gun, a bullet smashed it and the flying pieces blinded me, destroying my right eye and breaking the socket bone of the left. And then later, after partially recovering the sight of my left eye, I moved towards the right post but collapsed unconscious. I regained consciousness 12 hours later, a prisoner in the enemy lines, and was informed by a fellow prisoner that the enemy crossed the canal at 6 a.m. And then my third eyewitness account, Herbert Chandler. He was from Surrey, south of London. On the evening of the 22nd of March, the company to which I belonged was detailed to relieve a company of the 8th Battalion Rifle Brigade in the front line. We moved forward and relieved them. Later on in the night, I was walking along the line and met a Lewis gun team of the Scottish Rifles with their gun. They were supposed to be a little bit further to the right, closer to Jussy. I asked them what they were doing. They told me the enemy was in their post. So with the assistance of 2nd Lieutenant Wallace, we made a small counter-attack and drove the enemy out and put the gun in position. 2nd Lieutenant Wallace and I then went to Company HQ, and when we arrived there, we were told the enemy had broken through on the left. We then heard one of our support companies make a charge, in which 2nd Lieutenant Wallace joined with a few men, and that was the last I saw of him. I then told Captain Russell that I would warn the company what had happened, but as I was going, a verbal message was given to me to say the enemy had broken through on the right also. I went to inform Captain Russell and found him in a shell hole about 25 yards behind Company HQ. I gave him the message and asked what to do. He suggested going back, but I said I was going back to the company. My orderly looked round and told me Captain Russell was going back, so I then took command and decided to hold on. I had 1 officer left of the company and 1 machine gun corps officer with 1 gun. I sent a verbal message to Battalion HQ to say what had happened and what I was doing. We were being bombed on both flanks. I did not see either of the 2 officers again. About half an hour later, I heard troops advancing in my rear, and I could not see them for the mist. When they got close, I discovered they were the enemy, so I gave the order to fire, but they were able to get close under cover of the bank. They bombed us, and the flanks were closing in, and our bombs, unfortunately, the bottom sheet of this bit of paper was damaged, so I couldn't get the final lines incomplete. So it's broken there. And then got the men out, and that, another break, to our original front and tried to get round the flank of the enemy, but ran into a company of the enemy in a cutting in the bank, and so I was captured. Now, the next place the Germans are going to fight their way through is described on the maps and in the accounts as Chateau de Savriennois. Now, when you hear the names of all these villages and the names of these chateaux and so on, you probably imagine intact buildings, but you've got to understand they were all ruins. This photo is not the Chateau de Savriennois. It's a different one closer to Armentières from the New Zealand National Army Museum, but it gives you more of an idea of probably what it would have looked like, because this area was in what the Germans called the Elberich zone, named for Unternehmen Elberich, Operation Elberich. That was in 1917 when they had built the Hindenburg Line behind them and then retreated to shorten their front and basically did absolute scorched earth, wrecking everything that the war hadn't already damaged. If you watch the movie 1917, there's a scene there where they talk about the Germans cutting down the fruit trees and everything like that to damage it, a major war crime and something that seriously contributed to the French bitterness at the Treaty of Versailles. So don't think these villages are intact villages, they're mostly piles of rubble. And this is where the Grenadiers, having crossed, are heading for, down towards Flavy-le-Martel. And I found a picture of the train station. Not very impressive, I'd have to say. Most of these are just points on a map that each division and each regiment have been assigned to make sure that each regiment is following a pre-designated path and not, treading on each other's territory. And here are some photos of Flavy-le-Martel, and, well, the one on the bottom left shows what it should have looked like. The other photos show what it probably actually looked like during this battle. Just piles of rubble. Prussian Grenadier account continues. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the crossing of all the infantry of the 10th Infantry Division was completed, first on rafts and pontoons, then on the pontoon bridge so quickly made by the pioneers. In endless succession, the batteries, ammunition columns and baggage went over. On the bank just one, the 3 regiments are preparing, partly under artillery fire, for further action and attack. The Grenadiers, those on the right, and the 47th are expected to take the railroad embankment at Flavy-le-Martel. The 47th Regiment are one of the other ones in the 10th Division, that is. And the 3rd Regiment are the 398th Infantry Regiment, who will follow the attack. Major Gustav takes the 1st Battalion on the right and the 2nd Battalion in the first line. The 1st shall proceed to Flavy Station and take it on the right, the 2nd via Savriennois Chateau towards the railway embankment and Flavy village. The Fusilier Battalion is staggered to the right as a flank right guard to follow. On the right wing is the 1st Company, and on its left is the 3rd Company. Each is assigned a machine gun platoon from the 1st Company of Sergeant Schendel. It's after 10 a.m. before it begins. And now we turn to the British account from the History of the Rifle Brigade, and this is quoting a letter by Captain Squire. There were only 130 all ranks together, with about 80 of the 7th Battalion details on the left and some 60 of the 8th Battalion and of the 60th Division Flavian Cugny. There did not appear to be any other troops at all, but this body with no bombs or rifle grenades and only 2 Lewis guns and a limited amount of small arms ammunition held in check strong enemy forces from 8 a.m. until dark. No ammunition was wasted, fire was controlled. During the 12 hours contact with the enemy, 3 distinct positions were taken up within 400 yards of each other, and no withdrawal was made until large numbers of the enemy were round both flanks. Fire was so steady and deadly that the enemy never more than once dared to attempt a frontal attack, and thus time was saved while he had to work around the flanks. The enemy appeared to consist of fresh troops and clean new equipment. They were fresh troops brought off the Eastern Front. With the surrender of the Russians, they had a chance to rest them up, give them training for this kind of assault, and, this is the troops that he's describing. They advanced in columns of 4s and companies according to a well-planned method. When fired upon, their immediate action seemed almost automatic in its promptness and good order, and had obviously been practiced as a drill. Their method of advancing by companies round the valleys, using dead ground to the full, was characteristic of new, well-trained and fresh troops. The attack was supported by artillery fire on our positions, directed at times by as many as 7 German aeroplanes at once, which hovered above and fired very lights as signals. Light trench mortars were also employed with great accuracy. The German account resumes. After a short march through rough terrain, the companies unexpectedly encounter a closed, fiercely firing English rifle line. They attack, but the attack does not really get going. Then Officer Deputy Homan of the 1st Company, ignoring the angry fire, jumps up in front of his men and pushes them forward by his example and encouraging words. An unforgettable sight will stay with me, reports the leader of the 1st Company, Lieutenant Ryman, as I, running far ahead of the front, turned round and saw behind me the skirmish line charging forward. The assault line stops again. Lieutenant Ryman sees some Englishmen running back with their hands raised. Immediately he jumps up, swinging his stick, and with a huzzah he goes after the Englishman. Besides him charges the brave Schendel, his pistol in hand. His machine gun crews cannot keep up, because they're carrying their heavy guns. Many other men, too, could not keep up with a rapid advance, because the Grenadiers had all experienced 3 sleepless nights. So it happened that in many cases the officers, with a handful of men, who were thrown together from all sorts of companies, stormed far ahead of the mass of their own men. The 3rd Company suffered heavy casualties the first time they hit the enemy. Thus the distinguished NCO Sergeant Bremer received a severe wound in the neck and bled to death as he was positioning his machine gun next to Lieutenant Kyrie's. The fight is in full swing. Very soon the units are mixed in the fog and command is difficult. The enemy very strongly defend themselves, and we are struggling for hours, and the losses grow. Many Grenadiers are bleeding, and machine gunner Bonnet doesn't waver from the side of his leader, Lieutenant Kyrie's, even though he's badly injured. Gradually, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Companies succeed in achieving their goal, the railway embankment. A special feature of this is Officer Cadet Harman of the 1st Company, who, when the attack is about to falter, goes in front of his men to set an example, as well as Gefreiter, perhaps that's like a Lance Corporal, Gefreiter Freier, likewise of the 1st Company, who proves himself as the commander of a light machine gun. Likewise, with determination, Lieutenant Berger of the 2nd Company goes forth. He and Harman are wounded. Now also the 4th Company, Lieutenant Ramus, could be relieved. They had advanced head-on against the station, but for the most part they had lost their direction and in the fog stormed into the village at the side of the station. The rest of the company had not been able to join them. Lieutenant Posch writes, I had been ordered to proceed with my platoon on a broad front in the direction of the railway facilities. At first, there were only occasional shots, which mostly buzzed over us, but then the increasing rifle and machine gun fire is obviously targeted directly at us. As we advance to the vicinity of the installations, we are very close to the still invisible enemy, and in that most unfavourable moment, the wall of fog ruptures. Almost in no time, the March sun breaks through and gives our eyes a panorama of the village and the battle. About 300 metres ahead of us, the enemy sits in the best field position and opens a raging fire. And I had a walk around on Google Street View, and I'm standing, using Google Street View, with the railway line immediately behind me, looking in the direction of the Crozat Canal where the Germans were advancing from. So this is the field of fire the British would have had with the Germans out there with very little cover. And then I walked up that road and turned around for where the Germans would be and looked back towards Flevy-le-Martel. So the bottom picture shows you the view the Germans would have had, roughly speaking, when the mist rose. Individual grenades also hit, but do no significant damage. But we have to run 300 metres, and we leap for our lives. The terrain in front of us is completely smooth without any cover, with a good field of fire for the English. Since I no longer respect the courage of the enemy, I command again. Jump! On! March! March! Most grenadiers follow, but a raging fire hits us. The losses are high. We throw ourselves back, but since we're almost defenceless, I attempt to get myself a short distance to a small piece of cover, 5 metres in front of me. Then I feel a heavy blow on my right hip joint, as if I were getting hit with a rifle butt, and I'm lying on the ground bleeding. Then I roll on my back and watch to my horror as the enemy fires into my grenadiers, lying defenceless in the field. Some are hit several times. This unfortunate situation is put to an end by the success of the other companies, the flanking ones that the British talked about. Supported by their fire, the 4th now takes the station in a furious rush and the enemy skedaddle. Deputy Sergeant Manning shows exemplary bravery. Lieutenant Carey's comments describe this section of the fight. Under the pressure of the 1st and 3rd companies, the enemy gave way, and our heavy machine guns could help the beleaguered comrades at the station with flanking fire. The gun of Corporal Netwig was completely put out of action here. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Schleimer, was badly wounded. The crew of the gun were dead or wounded. And you can see what we're talking about with these heavy machine guns. This photo on the bottom right shows British troops after they've captured a German machine gun crew, forcing them to carry their own gun. You can see it's a real burden. Evans, a previously mentioned machine gunner Hoheisel, is seriously wounded. With 2 groups of the 1st Company, so he reports, we took position. The groups directly on the railway embankment, our guns about 500 metres behind, so that we could shoot over them. We had fired about 100 bullets, and then I got shot through the arm. I jumped up and was hit by a 2nd bullet that shattered my left leg. I fainted and lay for a long time exposed to the English fire, until I was found after our attack by Comrade Hoffman and was picked up by a medic. The brave man had to have his leg amputated. Now back to the Rifle Brigade account. The attack was supported by an artillery fire on our positions, directed at times by as many as 7 German aeroplanes. But the most effective support was given to the advancing infantry by machine guns, which did not stay behind and merely provide overhead fire, as seems to often be the role of our own machine guns, but which were brought right forward with the forward advance patrols, and as soon as any piece of ground or part of village was made good, the guns were mounted and caught our men as they fought the rearguard action. Whenever any of our men, wounded or otherwise, attempted to get back to new positions, a hail of bullets swept the forward slopes of the ground behind. As many as 12 machine guns would open from Flavy alone onto the northeast slopes of La Haute de Bois. And then we have one more account of a captured British officer who was, in fact, in Flavy. Robert Wilson, another Scotsman, this time from fairly close to Loch Lomond. On the morning of the 23rd of March 1918, my company were holding a position at Flavy-le-Martel, south of St. Quentin, France. The Boche made a successful attack on our left, and by the time D Company got the enemy was well round our flank. There was a perfect hail of machine gun bullets, and unfortunately I was hit, sustaining compound fracture of right tibia and also severe wound in right thigh. I was totally incapacitated and unable to carry on. As all our troops had withdrawn, I was left on the field where I was wounded and was subsequently picked up by the enemy Red Cross men. As I said, pretty typical of what was going on. Now, the Prussian account continues. Parts of the 1st Battalion had strayed from the battle and got into the village. This is described by Sergeant Menzel of the 4th Company. We ran like weasels through the village. Just get through, I urged my men. Each squad leader wanted to be the first to reach the exit, and Sergeant Claris joined me with a light machine gun, so we had a certain amount of firepower. So we reach the exit of the village, and a shot comes from a cellar hole, and we see Lieutenant Bott of the 2nd Company collapsing. But for the moment we cannot help him. First we have to clear the basement. We reach the house, but the English will not come out when we shout. Hand grenades into the house. A terrible roar, then one comes up, but with rifle in hand. He had to expect what he got, and he rolled dead back down the stairs. That probably scared the others back. Now there was no more pause. Corporal Claris took all the basement windows under fire until it became quiet. Only now could we take care of Lieutenant Bott. But it was too late. Sergeant Menzel continues. We still had a homestead in front of us. We took it under fire with a machine gun, and at the same time I wanted to use my men against it. But the enemy hit us so hard that we had to limit ourselves first to keeping the homestead under machine gun fire. Finally, the fire of the enemy died down. Around this time, our company leader, Lieutenant Ramus, arrives at our position. He praises us. I'm glad that my company has gone through the village so dashingly. I have NCOs whom I can rely on. He then went back through the village to collect his men, because already an English counterattack was being threatened. So I covered the company as a rear guard. NCOs Klose, Domke, Gangov, and many others were wounded. 15 Englishmen who suddenly appeared were captured without violence. We didn't neglect, by the way, despite all the heat of the fight, to pay a thorough visit to the English canteen. Yeah, the German accounts are just full of how delighted they were to capture British food and how much better it was than the food they'd been getting. Sgt Hain. The frontal attacking 2nd Battalion had meanwhile overcome savage resistance at Savriennois Chateau, then taken the railway embankment and was pushing further through Flavey. Sgt Hain of the 8th Company reports, the fight lasted 2 hours and the enemy was thrown back to the exit of the village, where they defended themselves again, and here a terrible house fight broke out. Through vigorous action by my company under Lieutenant Ishaka and a machine gun platoon under Lieutenant Schneider of the 2nd Machine Gun Company, all the officers with gun in hand, we managed to throw the enemy out of the village. The English suffered terrible losses. Few were taken prisoner. The enemy now flooded out of the village, again resisting harshly. And then I wasn't able to really find much more about what was going on, but I did find that this guy, George Henry Fairbairn, was given a medal for his defence in Flavey-le-Martel, so it's worth reading the description of why they gave him a medal. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. When his commanding officer had become a casualty, he took charge of the battalion and proved himself a capable leader under the most trying circumstances. He held on to positions to the last moment, retiring last himself and rallying the remains of his battalion. Now, back to the Germans, this time Lieutenant Helmut Hoffman. Another campaigner, Lieutenant Hoffman, Helmut, writes, Flavey was taken by storm and many a loyal companion sank into the grass, spurring on his comrades by his death. The young Lieutenant Schneider stormed ahead of the 2nd Battalion. Now and then he stopped and fired at the fleeing Englishmen like in a hunt. No warning call could hold him back. His example had an excellent effect on his men, who were faithful to him from day one. Flavey had become a bloodbath for the English, a special tribute to our proud grenadiers. The leader of the battalion, Captain Reimer, who always at the head urged his followers forward, had a great part in it. On the right there's a grave of 3 officers of the Grenadiers who were killed the next day on their attack on Cugny. Captain Squire's account continues. Considering that the enemy consisted of fresh troops, probably practised in open warfare, plentifully supplied with ammunition and greatly outnumbering our forces, and adding to this the fact that they had the support of artillery, light mortars, rifle grenades and machine guns, it was no disgrace that such a handful of men had to withdraw. The most that we could hope to do was to delay the enemy's advance so as to give time for the supports to come up behind. This we did. Sergeant Broughton was killed, an immense grief to me. He was a fine fellow. Rifleman Greenwell, A Company Lewis Gunner, did splendid work, wounded while staying to the last to give covering fire while the rest got back to the rear position. He's probably a prisoner. His only thought was of other people. He said to me when all the rest had gone, "Don't stay, sir. Leave me and save yourself. I shall be all right." His leg was broken, and I thought it was my duty to go and rally the men in the next position. Back to the 8th Battalion's War Diary. Enemy opened bombardment at 6 a.m. and advanced in force on Flavey Station. 10 a.m. Battalion withdrew to Flavey Petit Detroit Road with rearguard under Captain C.R. Barnes, DSO, in Flavey. So on this map here with the box, Flavey's at the top of this box, and Petit Detroit, well, Detroit if you're pronouncing it in an anglicised way, Little Detroit, is down. This is the road they're on leading down to Petit Detroit. About 3 p.m. the enemy had worked round our flanks, making a withdrawal necessary. Withdrawal carried out under heavy machine gun fire. Withdrawal through French, wrongly spelled, on Cugny-la-Neuville Road, covered by good resistance of Major F.E. Young and Captain Squire. Now, it's always a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly where they're going, but this is my best guess about the line of retreat and the position where some French troops were coming up. They were dismounted French dragoons. There weren't enough of them, and worse, they weren't properly supplied. They were an emergency stopgap measure that the French threw up to try to help the beleaguered English. They only had the ammunition they were carrying on themselves, and they rapidly depleted their supplies, and then many of them too became prisoners. And there's Captain Charles Barnes, who was mentioned in this account. He did rather well that day. He was only 21 years old, and while he might have survived this battle, he was killed later on in the German spring offensive on April the 21st, and his gravestone reads, "Until the day break and the shadows flee away." At 12 noon, the regimental staff arrives at the north entrance to the village. Nearby at the cemetery, a large number of captive Englishmen await the exodus, and this is from a different place in the German assault, but it does show Englishmen who had been captured by the Germans waiting to be sent back. Flavey still receives German friendly artillery fire, as the liaison officer, Lieutenant Ecker, has no communications to stop it, so the German artillery don't know the Germans are already in the village. The regiment now receives a new command from the division. It is to head to Belleau, 5 to 6 kilometres southwest of Flavey. The battalions arrange themselves for the new attack. The Fusilier battalion has also come up. Some 100 metres in front of the railway embankment we receive fire, reports Lieutenant Kraft, and Sergeant Gusser is severely wounded. We again continue towards Flavey. The battalion follows the 1st and 2nd, which advances against Anois and Cugny, 2 kilometres west of Flavey. Anois is taken quickly, so they've got to continue heading southwest. This is the line they're taking. So there's Anois, which is almost joined to Flavey. Anois is taken quickly, not so Cugny. There's going to be a major fight for Cugny. Now this is taken from the history of the Somerset Light Infantry. At dawn on the 23rd, the 2 companies on the canal bank reported the presence of German patrols in St. Simon. As soon as the sun rose, the fog became worse, and now it was possible to see only just across the canal. At 8 a.m, battalion headquarters were ordered back to Anois in order to be in close touch with the brigade. On reaching the railway, battalion headquarters came in touch with some men of the 14th Division, who said that the charges beneath the bridges at Jussy had failed to explode, and that the Germans were across and were then coming down the railway. The only company of the battalion then in touch with the battalion headquarters was A, under Captain McMurtrie, which was ordered to form a defensive flank from headquarters to the 3 companies along the canal bank. But the marshy ground effectively prevented this order being carried out, though A Company managed to keep in touch with the headquarters. So there's the marshy ground, and this is the personal account of Captain Douglas James McMurtrie, who was in command of A Company. We started to go across country in artillery formation, that means dispersed. Soon, however, Lieutenant Berry came rushing up to tell me that he had made a mistake and that we were to get back. We got back just as the enemy began to fire with heavy machine guns, and soon I got a message from the CO to form a defensive flank against the enemy, who were expected to attack by an encircling movement at any moment. We soon saw some men on the horizon, but it was impossible to make out whether they were Germans or our own men. The machine gun fire was pretty hot, and these men began running and at last reached us. They were men of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who had been fighting on the canal bank. And then McMurtrie tries to go back to Battalion HQ to find out what the heck's going on, and his account continues. I'd gone halfway and was just crossing a very marshy piece of ground when the enemy started shelling heavily. The machine gun fire and rifle fire increased, and then I saw the remainder of my company, headed by an officer, running back as fast as they could in terror, men dropping in all directions. It was impossible to form up the remainder in the swamp, so I led them over to battalion headquarters. Here I found that the enemy had advanced and was pushing forward his machine guns to try and encircle us. So this is where they started out, with their battalion HQ down there. So men of the 14th Division come running down there saying the Germans are in Jussy. And, well, that's the situation they find themselves in. So A Company, who had been somewhere in that general area, is told to try to form a defensive flank. And the account continues. From this time, the history of the Somerset Light Infantry. The end came quickly. Rifle and machine gun fire had suddenly become intense, and casualties were heavy. Acting Adjutant Berry fell dead. Lieutenant Colonel Troit Bullock was severely wounded, shot through the neck, whereupon Captain McMurtrie took command of the battalion headquarters as well as the survivors of his own company. The 3 companies on the canal bank were completely cut off and surrounded, and fighting all the way, Captain McMurtrie and his party fell back on the 7th Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, who had taken up a position some 2,000 yards west of Anois, north and south of the railway. From this position, however, it was evident a further retirement would have to be made, for by 6 p.m. the enemy had captured Eaucourt and Bruchy, both in the rear of the 7th Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. So this is roughly what we've got. The Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry are back there up the railway line. So battalion headquarters, along with A Company, retreats as best they can back to this position. Now, they claim that Eaucourt and Bruchy had Germans in them, but I'm very, very sceptical of this. Well, perhaps they had some German cavalry scouts, but this was far too far forward at this point in the battle for the Germans to have penetrated in any strength. But the Germans were definitely in strength at the position that had once been the battalion headquarters for the 7th Somersets. Now, they mentioned they attacked and cleared Eaucourt. Well, as I say, I imagine there weren't many Germans there, if any, maybe a figment of their imagination even. McMurtrie continues. Now, this account, from his account, is a bit hard to tell, because some of this, I think, may be talking about the initial attack when they're in Anhois, but I'm sure some of the rest of it actually talks to when they were trying to hold this position with the Duke of Cornwall's infantry between this very tiny village of Eaucourt and Ollezy, which is not much bigger, just a bit to its north. Also worth noting on this map, here is the boundary between Ain and the Somme, very, very close to the Somme. McMurtrie continues, Huns attacked us, and for about an hour we kept shooting at them and kept them at bay. Lieutenant Berry, who was next to me firing away, got up to look over the bank over which we were shooting. He got a bullet right through the head and was killed instantly, falling on top of me with a groan. Berry was one of the best and kindest men I've ever come across. I was very upset to see him killed. I now had to take command of the battalion headquarters. Ammunition was giving out, and the Germans were gradually working round us and threatening to surround us at any minute. I considered it would be a waste of life to hold on any longer, having done all we could to delay the enemy for as long as possible. A great many men had already been killed or wounded, and I decided that it was time to withdraw. Back to the history of the Somerset Light Infantry. Ammunition began to run out, and a retirement was ordered. Captain McMurtrie's party was ordered to form part of the rear guard and hang on as long as possible to the position. He's ordered by the colonel in charge of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, by the way. So well did these gallant fellows carry out their orders that when the time came for them to fall back, they found themselves completely surrounded and cut off, and Captain McMurtrie and about 9 survivors were captured by the enemy, and there are British prisoners being taken back from the spring offensive. McMurtrie. Almost immediately the rest started withdrawing, and after they got clear I gave the order to withdraw too. I had learnt a lesson from Cambrai, and was determined not to let the men start running, for once they did in such a situation it was impossible to hold them. I had my revolver out, and anyone who tried to run I immediately threatened to shoot. This stopped all the running, but it was the worst hour I've ever been through. The enemy were lining the ridge and pouring a deadly fire into us. Shells and shrapnel were bursting everywhere. German aeroplanes started flying over us and firing into our midst. Men were dropping everywhere, some were wounded and calling out for help. Others were dying and groaning in their pain. So this is where they were trying to hold, and they just get completely overwhelmed by the Germans, who are just speed of assault. Go, go, go. Take the casualties, but just go. The end was very near, and soon we ran bang into a huge number of German artillery and transport and were captured. A German on a horse came up and led me to believe that he wanted my revolver and kit, and so I gave him my revolver. He took it and fired it into the ground. I had heard, as everyone else had, of the awful treatment by Germans of their prisoners, and so thought this German was trying my revolver in order to shoot me. I waited, but nothing happened. I was told to take the rest of my kit off, and then, being very thirsty, got my water bottle out, filled it from a stream, and at last got a drink, the first one for 24 hours. After capture, an officer and some men came up to us. The officer spoke English and was quite friendly, and amongst other things asked me my rank and age. The German could not believe that an officer of 19 could be a captain, but I believe a captain in the German army has a larger body of men to command. So, what about D Company under Foley? What had happened to them? Well, the battalion headquarters had vanished off to the west, and they had come back down here to try and see what the heck was going on, only to discover that the Germans were already in the area where they thought their own battalion HQ was going to be. Now, Prussian Grenadiers. The Englishman shows himself as a master of retreat, amazing in his ability to adapt to the terrain. English snipers with quick-loading rifles are tenaciously defending the houses on the road to Cugny, performing their task of blocking them brilliantly. The regimental staff is in the front line. We have to wait until our mortars, our Minenwerfers, make a clearing. Brave work by our MGs, our machine guns, keeps the enemy under fire, who tries to retire on the right and left of the road to the protection of Hill 74. Behind them, the enemy sets himself ready to offer more resistance, and the fire of his artillery revives, while the absence of ours, which has not yet come across the canal, is very much felt. Thus Lieutenant Eggers characterises the situation in front of Cugny in the afternoon. Major Gustav sends him forward to vigorously bring forward the riflemen's lines, which are strongly set back on the right. It succeeds. The skirmish line is charging forward, but I get shot in the thigh, which throws me to the ground. Cugny must be taken no matter what. That was the order. But we do not succeed. The enemy defends himself desperately, and the attack area offers no cover. Although parts of the 398th Infantry Regiment are used, we still do not succeed in conquering the village. Only when incoming artillery has vigorously prepared the attack do we win. Already at dusk, the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Grenadiers use the terrain and close on Cugny, some sniping through trees and bushes, and soon its companies invade the place. That means it's time for the 1st Battalion to fix bayonets and charge. In the melee, the enemy is expelled from the northern edge of Cugny. The goal is reached, some 100 prisoners are taken. Parts of the Fusilier Battalion had also been used. Lieutenant Kraft writes, I spread out the company and finally deploy everybody. Unfortunately, I do have to complain about how many we lost. So, as I said, they'd gone back there, they'd gone there, trying what's going on, and the Germans are there, so they retreated down towards Cugny. So the 7th Somersets are down there. Now, that's what I just said. Now he joins up with another battalion from his brigade, the 12th King's Liverpools. By now, the overwhelming nature of the catastrophe had come home to us. That anything like this swift, overpowering onslaught could happen had seemed incredible. Here were the Germans, 12 miles inside our lines in 3 days. A sense of calamity filled us, but no feeling of despair. Behind us, we thought, in our ignorance, there must be many troops in position. For ourselves, the situation seemed pretty grave. We were only an isolated force, made up of a dozen different units. In strength, I should say, not more than 200. Now, the war diary of the 12th King's Liverpools gives precise coordinates for where they put their men. So it says they put 2 companies in the keeps right there. They had 1 company in this tree line over here, and another company on this crossroads right there. They give the coordinates by these, see R there and the numbers on the map. See, this is 15 and, there's 11, etc., etc. Now, it's a bit more vague about where the 7th Somerset Light Infantry are. Now, the battalion headquarters is back with the Duke of Cornwall's up there to the north, where I put the green X. But Captain Foley's D Company have joined up with the Liverpools, and I put them approximately where I think they must have been, with the dark blue cross on the bottom. Now, Foley. It was extraordinary at times like that, how any formed body of men under proper control, however small it might be, seemed to attract to it the stragglers from miles around. In an incredibly short time, the banks of our sunken road were thick with men, belonging, I suppose, to a dozen different brigades. So that's roughly where the Liverpools and this single company of the Somersets are. And then we turn to an account by the Lieutenant Colonel, who seems to have been in charge of 1, possibly 2 different battalions of the Royal Irish Rifles. The morning of the 23rd of March, shortly after midday, both the 1st and 2nd Battalions were ordered to Cugny. The 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Rifles proceeded to occupy a defensive position east and northeast of the village, astride the Cluny-Flavy-le-Martel road. Another battalion, belonging, I thought, to the 14th Division, were on their right, prolonging the position southwards. The 1st Battalion Royal Irish Rifles under my command, and we held in readiness on the high ground south of Cugny and Square R25. During the afternoon, large bodies of Germans are observed collecting under the trees in Square R27B and D. The 1st Battalion had by this time occupied a position which I had selected. To the best of my recollection, it was about 3:45 p.m. that the enemy's advance commenced. Now, who was this mystery battalion? Now, turning to the official history, it says they were the 13th Entrenching Battalion. In other words, they were never really expected to be a combat battalion. Their job was to dig ditches and trenches and so on. It should be little wonder, therefore, they broke and ran before anybody else. So, this was preceded by an intense machine gun bombardment which continued until the light began to fall. About 4:30 p.m, large numbers of the men belonging to the battalion in front, let's go back again, to which I referred, commenced a somewhat disorderly withdrawal through the left of my battalion. I went forward to find out what was happening and met the colonel of this battalion being carried back on a stretcher in a dying condition. His men were now retiring hastily. So that entrenching battalion are gone. It was now dusk and getting dark quickly. The noise of musketry and German shouting and cheering was great. They had broken through on my left front, there being no troops left there to stop them, and were firing at us an enfilade at short range. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the 2nd Battalion did, but this is my best guess based on their account of where they went. Shortly afterwards, they charged us from the front and left. They were in superior numbers and we were overrun. In the turmoil, I was hit and knocked down. I shouted to all I saw to retire south along the road. A few hundred yards back, I was able to collect the majority of the battalion. I then decided to withdraw to the next high ground, which was in the vicinity of Belleau, which is down to the bottom left. Well, that's the 1st Battalion, but the 2nd Battalion got stuck in Cugny. Meanwhile, up there, the 7th Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry have retreated, leaving McMurtrie to be captured up there. And as near as I can work out, the Liverpools with the Somersets withdraw down here to the road leading out towards the west out of Cugny. And the Germans have taken that position too. Now, Colonel MacCarthy-O'Leary sent forward messages to orders for the 2nd Battalion to withdraw through the 1st. No answer was received, so they stayed put, runners being all killed or wounded. In any case, Captain Bryans had been ordered to fight to the last, and had moreover come to the conclusion that an attempt to retire over open ground with machine guns on either flank would mean annihilation. If his little force was to be destroyed, it should die to better purpose. There cannot be many instances, even in the late war, of a battalion being blotted out so completely as this. Only the transport, a handful of who were employed with it, and a few officers kept back, and those on leave were left. And that brings us to the war diary of this battalion that got destroyed. 10 a.m. a defensive position northeast of the village was taken up. The remnant of D Company that was already massively depleted was also with us, together with reinforcements under the command of Lieutenant Boyle, who rejoined the battalion that morning. They are in reserve northwest of the village. 9 a.m. reports received that enemy patrols of cavalry had entered Flaville-Martel, and brigade orders directed that Cugny was to be held at all costs. With the exception of 1 or 2 minor attacks, the afternoon passed quietly. Hostile aeroplanes were, however, very much in evidence. There's pictures of captured German aircraft, actually by New Zealanders in the Middle East. 6 p.m. The enemy attacked in force, but after a stiff fight was repulsed on our front, but later he succeeded in driving back the troops on the right, and he occupied the positions between the battalion and the village. A party of C Company under Lieutenant Marriott Watson, which was returning to the village, came in contact with a strong part of the enemy. Lieutenant Marriott Watson spoke to the enemy in German and succeeded in allaying their suspicion, thus enabling the party to get into close quarters to rush and disperse the enemy. 10 p.m. The battalion withdrew to a line 300 yards west of the village. No contact could be established with troops on either flanks. The night passed quietly, although the enemy could be heard, evidently in force in the immediate front. Marriott Watson is killed in this battle. He was quite a talented individual, not only fluent in German, also taught himself to read Japanese, would you believe, but he did not survive. Then back to the war diary. March 24th. Touch was established with troops who had during the night moved forward. Enemy machine gun fire was very heavy during the morning, but no infantry advanced to the attack on the battalion front, although on the right and left he succeeded in driving back our troops. Our flanks were slightly withdrawn to form defensive flanks. 2 p.m. The enemy advanced, preceded by very heavy artillery bombardment and overwhelming strength on our front and both flanks, although the battalion put up a most stubborn resistance. All, with the exception of about 10 wounded other ranks and 10 unwounded, were killed or taken prisoner. The following officers became casualties, lots of men listed as dead or missing. And this is how little there was left of the battalion. On March the 26th, it records that the battalion consisted of 4 officers and 50 other ranks under the command of Captain Murphy. That's it. That was all that was left of the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. The Germans in Cugny. Patrols are advanced on the road to Ham and Villeselve. Lt.Col of the 2nd Battalion makes a cycling patrol towards Libermont. He is wounded, but brings back valuable information. Now finally the formations can be reorganised. Also in Cugny, we found a supply store with rich pickings, so that the German field kitchens had to turn back with full cookers. There was a great deal of confusion in the village because squads from all 3 regiments of the division were moving about in the streets. Midnight approaches and the troops hope finally to find some hours of undisturbed rest, the first since the 19th of March, but it didn't turn out that way. As soon as deep sleep envelops the men who are much in need of rest, a bombardment howls and barks into Cugny with a wild crash. The English, who of course knew what attraction the supply depot would have, bombards the place. A wild frenzied race is the result. We tried to avoid the heavy impacts, but there was nothing to do but pull the battalions back behind the edge of the village. Here the Grenadiers found some very short hours of rest. Now this is going to be the end of Foley with his company. As quickly as possible, the men were led out to where they were to dig, and with entrenching tools, for we had no shovels, they started on the big task of getting down under cover before daylight. My own men, realising the value of a good trench when shells and bullets are flying, got to work with a will, and were soon under quite substantial cover. But the Shropshires, who were completely green, they'd found a couple of companies of them, but they'd never been in combat before, who besides being thoroughly tired were also quite new to the game, indeed needed continual watching and urging to make them dig at all. In spite of this and the danger of our situation, it was the greatest comfort to me to be doing something definite towards stopping the overwhelming enemy advance, feeble and unsupported though our effort was. So this is now from Foley's I put 1921, it was a 1920 account. Now this is what involved. Now his map in his book is not north-south, so the orientation to match up with the trench map is like I put it there on this diagonal thing. And this is what he describes, with himself being in this forward keep. The Germans first attack on the left, and then they attack on the right. Foley believed that reinforcements were coming up at any moment. In fact, they were not, and there was just nothing behind them. And he writes, "At about noon, the enemy machine gun fire showed a marked increase, and this we knew to be the harbinger of a fresh attack. The advance was made in the first place on our extreme right, and we had perfectly clear view of the whole thing. We let the enemy get well out of the village. The German advance was made by short rushes across the open in excellent order, and as they scrambled to their feet and raced for it, we poured lead into them at a range of 300 yards. I took the rifle from the man next to me and settled down to killing Germans with a lust, which, when considered in cooler moments afterwards, rather amazed me. We could hardly miss at so short a range, and their casualties were very heavy, especially among the machine gunners, who had to move in pairs with their heavy weapons slung on a sort of stretcher between them." There's a photo of German machine gunners carrying their machine guns on that stretcher. "We had rather forgotten in our thirst for enemy blood how quickly ammunition can be exhausted, and long before I expected it the men were reporting that they'd run out, and from that moment we became little more than spectators. Proportionately as our fire slackened, the Germans had pushed on. In a kind of fascination we watched them push on, covered by the fire of a 4.2 battery. That on the right is a German 4.2 artillery gun. It's been test-fired by a New Zealander, because it's a photo from after it was captured, but it is a German gun. Until suddenly our main line broke and we saw its garrison running in a confused mob down the road. I observed now that the garrison of my position had been reduced, through departures to the rear and casualties, to only a couple of men besides myself. We three were thus, as it were, an island, entirely surrounded by a sea of victorious enemies. The gravity of the situation came home to me with sparkling clearness. We were now in one of those plights when a soldier has to consult whatever conscience he may possess, and choose between a death of doubtful glory, but obvious futility, or surrender. We had just killed how many of their fellows? Why should they not shoot us down now? Well, they didn't. Thus in bitter passing ended my 3 years of active service in France. In a few minutes we joined the little straggling, despondent groups who were trailing back through the German lines. With all those grey figures around us, I had the sensation of being swallowed alive. Very little notice was taken of us at this point, and those are lines of British prisoners heading back to captivity. I joined a company with 2 officers of the Liverpools who were amongst the party. Our first stopping place was a small dressing station where a little crowd of interested spectators gathered round to have a look at us. They were quite friendly and gave us cigarettes. The whole countryside seemed to be alive with Germans, and all the way back we met battalion after battalion of grey-clad, steel-helmeted troops, marching with a steady, inexorable pace towards the battle line. And there's a massive line of British prisoners being sent to the back, past a German aid station. If you can see a red cross in the background. And I'm fascinated by this fellow with an interesting-looking hat. Can't help wondering who he is and what's his story. Now, the 1st Royal Irish Rifles had succeeded in retreating down here, so they had at least managed to disengage while the other units had been largely destroyed in Cugny or defending the road just out of it. And the Germans are victorious in taking the village. And this was the point basically where I thought I could keep going on and on and on, but I had to call it quits somewhere, so this is where I decided to end this particular battle narrative. And so we conclude with what the official history had to say. Trained in and accustomed to trench warfare, little practised in open fighting, and entirely unpractised in the conduct of retreat, units and formations were inclined to leave a position directly one of its flanks was turned. The opportunities of dealing with parties of the enemy who advanced into pockets were practically neglected. Without the use of telegraphic and telephonic communication with their brigades, which the signal sections, even had they possessed the material, could neither lay nor maintain at the speed of this new form of warfare, with the congestion of the roads preventing the use of cars, and the shell-pitted and broken surface of the devastated area slowing down the pace of horses, divisional staffs were unable to keep in constant touch with the front. Even communication between corps and divisions was irregular and belated. Orders to hold positions to the last might be sent, but even if they reached their destination it was often too late or impossible to carry out. What might have been a series of rearguard actions became a mere retirement from one line to another. Now, I would ask you to compare what the official history had to say with the account I've just given you. I do not think the official history gave an accurate or fair description of just how tenaciously and how hard these British units fought, and how many units really did indeed stand and fight to the end, and in the times when they did withdraw, it was absolutely tactically necessary, because if they failed to withdraw, they would be flanked on both sides and utterly destroyed. So I do not agree with this official summary. And that only took an hour and a half. Well, there you go. Putting my foot down and cutting out all digressions and just staying with the battle narrative, I gave you a single account in an hour and a half. If you want it fleshed out with lots of descriptions of many men involved and other background details, go and watch part 1 and part 2, but this was the shortened version for you. And with that, I will say good evening to you.